In every bustling market, there are rules you follow and secrets you keep. When a man sets up his meat store, there's one thing no one expects to see: his meat is untouched by flies. While other vendors constantly battle the buzzing insects, his store remains pristine, drawing the attention of curious buyers. But behind his secret lies a lesson about perception, trust, and survival that no one ever imagined. Why are the flies absent from his meat, and what does this mystery reveal about the man who keeps this strange, yet vital, secret? The market was alive, as it always was, with the sounds of vendors calling out their wares, children running between stalls, and the aroma of fresh bread and sizzling meats filling the air. There was no place quite like it. Each vendor had their own corner, their own space to show off their goods, and each stall had its own unique characteristics that made it stand out. But amidst the usual hustle, there was one stall that drew the most attention. It wasn't because of its variety, or its display, but because of the absence of something everyone else struggled with: flies. Flies were the unwelcome companions of every butcher in the market. They hovered over the freshly slaughtered meat, landing and swarming around the cuts. No matter how hard the butcher swatted at them or covered the meat with cloths, the flies always returned. They were a part of the process, an inconvenience that everyone simply accepted as part of selling meat in the heat of the day. But there was one stall where this never happened. The butcher who ran this stall, a quiet man named Temba, always had the freshest meat. It wasn't just the freshness that caught everyone's eye, though. It was the fact that his meat was always free from the swarms that plagued the others. Not a single fly dared land on his cuts. This caught the attention of everyone who passed by. How was it possible? Why was his stall different from all the others? At first, the other butchers were too proud to ask him. They whispered among themselves, speculating about Temba's secret. Some thought it was the cleanliness of his stall, the way he kept everything immaculate. Others wondered if there was something in the way he prepared the meat, some special technique he had learned over the years. Maybe, some of the younger vendors jokingly suggested, he was using some kind of magic to ward off the flies. But there was no definitive answer. The mystery of his stall grew with each passing day. Some customers who came to buy from him would linger a little longer than necessary, studying the meat in disbelief, inspecting the cuts for any signs of flies. They never found any. Word spread quickly. Soon, a few curious customers began to ask him how he managed to keep his meat so pristine. Temba, as always, remained quiet and avoided directly answering their questions. He smiled, shrugged, and simply offered them another cut of meat to taste. Yet the rumors continued to swirl. Every morning, as the other vendors began to prepare their own meat, trying to prevent the inevitable invasion of flies, Temba's store remained calm and unaffected. His meat was untouched, fresh, and inviting, and the flies never seemed to bother it. No one could figure out the trick. The other butchers started to talk among themselves more openly. They had seen Temba's success, his growing customer base, and the respect he commanded in the market. They watched as his store became a place where people flocked, drawn by the invisible allure of cleanliness and quality. The flies never seemed to bother him, and they couldn't help but wonder why. Had he found a solution to something that had plagued them for so long? Or was there something deeper at play? Some began to quietly observe his methods. Temba would arrive early each morning, carefully unloading his cut of meat, but never did he seem to rush. His preparations were methodical and calm, almost as though he had all the time in the world. He handled each piece with great care, almost as if he were treating each cut as something precious. The other butchers couldn't help but notice how carefully he placed the meat on his store, the way he kept everything organized and neat. But no one could identify the key to his success. At first, it was a mystery, but as time passed, the other butchers began to feel the pressure. They couldn't keep asking questions or speculating forever. Their pride got in the way. They didn't want to appear as if they were copying him or admitting they couldn't handle a simple problem like keeping flies away. The truth was that everyone had tried their best. They had all taken steps to deal with the problem, shooing away flies, covering the meat, using cloths and nets. But nothing worked as well as Temba's method. Temba's store was becoming a source of quiet fascination, not just for the other butchers, but for everyone who frequented the market. People would walk by, steal a glance, and wonder, how does he do it? They started to tell stories about his store, about how Temba had somehow found the secret to keeping flies away, and the mystery only deepened with each passing day. The market became a place of whispers, as each vendor silently envied Temba's success, though they were too proud to ask him directly. But the truth was, they didn't need to keep wondering. The answer was right in front of them. There was no magic, no mysterious formula. It was simply the way he took care of his meat, the way he approached his craft with patience and dedication. Temba had figured out something the others hadn't, a way to keep his products fresh and fly-free without resorting to the usual methods. But for now, it remained a mystery. As the weeks passed, the curiosity surrounding Temba's stall only grew. The other butchers had begun to talk more openly about the mystery, but no one dared to ask Temba directly. Some of the older vendors, who had been in the market for years, began to take it personally. They were proud of their trade, proud of the methods they had learned over time. It was a point of honor that their stores were as clean as possible, but it wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about tradition. They didn't want to admit that Temba might have discovered something they hadn't, something so simple and effective that it kept his meat free of flies while their own efforts fell short. But the rumors kept circulating. Every day, people continued to notice the difference. Temba's meat was pristine, and his store remained calm, unaffected by the usual nuisance of flies. His customers noticed it, too. Some even mentioned it, praising the quality of his goods. But the most common comment was about the flies. There were none. And soon, the other butchers realized that the mystery wasn't just about keeping the flies away, it was about how Temba's success had created a shift in the market dynamics. More and more customers were gravitating toward his store, attracted by the cleanliness and freshness of his product. His reputation was growing, and with it, the envy of his fellow vendors. The butchers' frustrations began to build. Some took to covering their meat with even more cloths, using nets, or trying different methods to keep the flies away, but nothing seemed to work. The flies would come and go, as if they were always one step ahead. No matter how much they swatted or waved their hands, the buzzing insects would always return. The stores filled with the sounds of constant swatting, but the buzzing persisted. By now, the other vendors had stopped talking behind Temba's back. They had become more vocal in their dissatisfaction with their own methods. They started asking each other if anyone knew Temba's secret. But no one seemed to have the answer. His methods remained a mystery, and the more they thought about it, the more the frustration mounted. It wasn't just about flies anymore, it was about the loss of their customer base, the erosion of their reputation. Temba was making money, and they were losing out. One afternoon, after the market had settled down, one of the younger butchers, desperate to learn Temba's secret, finally approached him. His name was Juma, a vendor who had only been in the market for a few years but had quickly become known for his high-quality meats. However, his store was constantly plagued by flies, and he had started to lose customers to Temba. It was becoming a serious problem. Juma walked up to Temba's store, his heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and humility. He couldn't hide the frustration in his voice when he spoke. Temba, Juma began, looking around to make sure no one else was within earshot. How do you do it? How do you keep your meat so fresh and fly-free? I've tried everything. I've tried nets, cloths, even vinegar, but nothing works like your store. What's your secret? Temba paused for a moment, looking at Juma with a quiet smile. For a moment, he considered the question. He knew that his method was simple, but it wasn't something he had openly shared. He had grown accustomed to the puzzled looks from his fellow vendors, and he hadn't felt the need to explain himself. But now, seeing Jumo's genuine frustration, Temba decided it was time to share what he had learned. "You're not the first to ask," Temba said, his voice calm and measured. "And I'm happy to share, but I want you to know that the answer isn't some magic trick or special product. It's all about understanding the simple things that most people overlook." Jumo's eyes widened with curiosity. "What do you mean? What is it that I'm missing?" Temba looked out at the market, watching the other butchers work. "The first thing you need to understand is that flies don't just land on meat because of the smell or the warmth. They are attracted to something deeper, the temperature. When meat is too warm, it attracts flies. When it's kept at the right temperature, the flies won't bother it. It's that simple." Jumo blinked, taking in the information. "But how do you control the temperature? We all try to keep our stores cool, but it doesn't seem to make a difference." Temba nodded. "The key is not just to keep it cool, but to keep it cold, colder than everyone else's stores. I use ice that I get from the river early in the morning before the sun comes up. I pack my meat in a way that keeps it cool for the entire day. The ice prevents the flies from laying eggs, and as long as the meat stays cold, they won't bother it." Jumo's eyes lit up with understanding. "So, it's not about swatting or covering it, but about controlling the environment. I've been trying to fight the flies instead of keeping them away from the source." Temba smiled, nodding. "Exactly. It's not about fighting nature, it's about working with it. Once you understand that, it becomes easy." Jumo's heart sank a little, realizing how much he had overlooked. He had been so focused on trying to cover up the problem that he hadn't thought to address the root cause. Now that he understood, he felt both relieved and embarrassed. He had spent so much time and effort on methods that didn't work, when the answer had been right in front of him all along. As Jumo left Temba's stall, he felt a sense of gratitude and resolve. The answer wasn't some magical secret, it was a simple solution that required patience, awareness, and understanding of the basics. The next morning, Jumo arrived early at the market, determined to follow Temba's advice. He went to the river, gathered ice, and made sure his meat was kept cold throughout the day. The result was immediate. Not only did the flies stay away, but his customers noticed the difference. Word spread quickly through the market, and soon, more vendors began to follow suit, using ice to keep their meat fresh. Temba's secret was no longer a mystery, but the lesson he had taught the market was far greater than just keeping flies away. It was about understanding the small details, working with nature, and being open to learning new ways to improve. The market, once filled with frustration, now buzzed with a renewed sense of cooperation, with each vendor realizing that sharing knowledge was the true path to success. As the days turned into weeks, the market slowly began to transform. Temba's simple advice about keeping the meat cold had spread like wildfire. Jumo, following the wisdom Temba had shared, found himself with a newfound sense of pride. Not only had he solved the problem of flies swarming his meat, but he had also earned the respect of his fellow butchers. The market was abuzz with activity, and for the first time in a long time, it seemed like everyone was working together to improve their stalls. Temba's success was no longer a mysterious anomaly. The vendors who once whispered about his methods were now coming to him for advice, and some were even sharing their own tips for keeping their stores clean. Temba, though, was content to let them discover things for themselves. He wasn't interested in becoming the center of attention, he just wanted to see the market thrive. Jumo, now with a successful stall of his own, made it a point to regularly check in with Temba. Their conversations grew deeper, and they started discussing more than just business. They talked about life in the village, the struggles of running a store, and how they could improve their relationships with the villagers. As the relationship between the two vendors strengthened, it became clear that Temba's decision to share his knowledge had not only benefited the market but had also deepened the bonds between the vendors. But despite the positive changes, there were still those in the market who were reluctant to follow Temba's advice. They stuck to their old ways, unwilling to accept the simple truth that flies could be kept away with a little bit of effort and awareness. These stubborn vendors became the subject of conversation among their peers, as everyone speculated about why they refused to change their methods. They were still struggling to control the flies, while Temba's store continued to thrive. The villagers, too, noticed the difference, with some choosing Temba's meat over the others simply because of the absence of flies. Slowly, the tide began to turn, and more vendors began to experiment with ice and cooler temperatures, realizing that Temba's advice had been not just helpful but essential for their success. However, not everyone was quick to embrace the change. Some of the older vendors, particularly those who had been in the market for years, continued to resist. They had built their businesses over decades, and they weren't about to change their practices just because one younger vendor had found a solution. To them, it felt like an attack on their way of doing business, a challenge to their authority and their hard-earned experience. They couldn't understand why they should embrace such a simple solution when they had managed to get by all these years without it. Temba, however, did not take offense to their resistance. He knew that change was difficult, and some people simply weren't ready for it. He had seen it before in the village, where tradition and pride often stood in the way of progress. He understood that the older vendors, who had seen so much in their time, were protective of the methods that had worked for them in the past. But Temba also understood that there was no shame in learning, no shame in evolving, and that the marketplace was not just a place for selling goods, but for learning and growing together. One day, as Temba walked at his store, an older vendor named Mzi approached him. Mzi had been in the market for as long as anyone could remember, and his reputation as a skilled butcher was well known. He had always been successful, but lately, the flies had begun to take a toll on his business. Mzi had noticed the change in the market and how Temba's meat was always fresh and free from flies. After observing Temba for weeks, Mzi finally decided to ask him for help. "Temba," Mzi began, his voice gruff but sincere. "I've been in this market longer than anyone. I've seen many things come and go. But I see that you found something that works. Something that the rest of us can't seem to figure out. I'm not too proud to ask for help. How do you do it?" Temba smiled, his patience and kindness shining through. "It's simple, Mzi. It's about the temperature. Keeping the meat cold, not just cool, makes all the difference. You need to find a way to keep it colder than the surrounding air, and that keeps the flies away. The ice from the river does the job for me, but you can use other methods too. The key is to understand the science behind it, not just keep fighting it." Mzi listened closely, nodding in agreement. He had never considered using ice before, and the idea of it felt foreign to him. But he also understood that to survive in the changing market, he had to adapt. "I see," Mzi said. "I've always trusted my methods, but it seems like things are changing. I can't keep doing things the same way if it's not working anymore. I'll try your method." Over the next few days, Mzi started to implement the changes. He brought in ice from the river, just like Temba had suggested, and began to see the results almost immediately. The flies, once a constant presence, were now nowhere to be seen. His meat stayed fresh for longer, and his customers began to return, drawn by the quality of the product. Word of Mzi's transformation spread quickly through the market, and soon, more vendors began to follow suit. The market was changing, and not just in the way the meat was handled. The spirit of cooperation was taking root, and the vendors were beginning to share their knowledge and tips with each other. It was no longer about competition, it was about improving together. Temba's simple act of sharing had not only transformed his own business, but it had helped create a community of vendors who supported each other. The market became a place where ideas were exchanged freely, and everyone benefited from the collective wisdom. But the true change was in the atmosphere of the market. Once a place of competition and pride, it had become a hub of collaboration. Temba's willingness to share his secret had broken down barriers and allowed the vendors to see that working together could bring more success than trying to outdo each other. The market was no longer filled with tension and frustration, it was a space where everyone could thrive, each learning from the other's experience. The flies were no longer a problem for most of the butchers in the market, but more importantly, the lessons learned from Temba's quiet approach to business had left an indelible mark on the village. Sometimes, the most powerful solutions are the simplest ones. The market continued to buzz with activity as the days passed, but the atmosphere was noticeably different now. What once had been a place of competition, rivalry, and frustration was slowly turning into a space of cooperation and shared knowledge. The flies, which had once symbolized the struggle of the vendors, were no longer the problem they once were. The butchers, who had spent countless hours swatting and covering their meat in an attempt to keep the pest at bay, had finally found the solution they had been desperately searching for, the simple, effective method that Temba had introduced. It wasn't just the meat that had changed, the vendors, too, had undergone a transformation. They had learned something invaluable, not just about keeping flies away, but about the importance of humility, sharing, and working together. The market had become a reflection of the wisdom Temba had imparted, and now it was a place where the vendors looked out for one another rather than trying to outdo each other. Temba himself remained humble. He never sought the spotlight or recognition for his actions. He simply did what he knew was right, quietly sharing his knowledge with those who were willing to listen. He had no interest in becoming a hero or gaining fame. His reward was seeing the market thrive and knowing that he had played a role in bringing about a positive change. Temba's store, once the subject of curiosity, now stood as a symbol of integrity and wisdom. It wasn't about the quality of his meat alone, it was about the respect he had earned, not just for his products, but for the way he had handled his business and his relationships with others. Juma, the young butcher who had first approached Temba for help, was one of the first to recognize the full extent of what had happened. At first, he had been focused solely on the practical aspect of keeping the flies away, but now he saw that the change in the market was deeper. It was about learning from each other, growing as a community, and making sure that everyone had the opportunity to succeed. Juma had started to share his newfound knowledge with other vendors, and soon, there was a ripple effect. The entire market had become a space for open dialogue, where ideas and solutions flowed freely. The older butchers, once resistant to change, had begun to see the value in collaboration. They were no longer afraid to ask for advice or offer suggestions to others. There was no shame in learning, and there was no longer any fear of being left behind. The changes were not just seen in the market stalls, but in the way the village as a whole began to operate. The once divided community of vendors had transformed into a tight-knit group that supported one another in ways they hadn't before. The village itself began to feel the effects of this shift. The pride that had once divided the vendors now became a source of strength. People talked less about what they could do better than others and more about what they could do together. The villagers had learned that progress didn't come from competition, it came from unity, trust, and shared wisdom. As more and more vendors adopted Temba's methods, the whole market began to improve. Not only did the flies stay away, but the quality of the meat became more consistent, and the customers started noticing the difference. They weren't just drawn to the cleanliness of the stalls, they were also impressed by the vendors' newfound sense of community and the way they worked together. The market became a place of energy, innovation, and cooperation. The villagers, once skeptical, now looked at the market with pride. It was no longer just a place to buy and sell, it had become a symbol of change and growth. One of the most important lessons the market had learned was that success wasn't just about individual achievements. It wasn't about being the best or the first, it was about building something together, about creating a space where everyone could thrive. Temba's influence had gone far beyond his ability to keep flies away from his meat. His willingness to share his knowledge, to help others, had sparked a chain reaction that had transformed the way the vendors viewed their business and their relationships with each other. He had shown them that there was no need to keep secrets, that the strength of the market came from the collective efforts of everyone involved. But the transformation didn't stop at the market. The vendors began to carry this newfound sense of cooperation into other aspects of their lives. They began helping each other in their personal lives, offering support during difficult times, and celebrating each other's successes. The market had become a microcosm of the village's larger potential for change. The village, once divided by competition and pride, was beginning to come together as a whole. It wasn't just about selling meat anymore, it was about building a community, creating an environment where everyone could grow and thrive. Temba, who had quietly observed the changes around him, smiled to himself. He never expected that a simple piece of advice, keeping meat cold to prevent flies, would lead to such a profound shift in the community. He had never sought recognition or praise. He had simply wanted to help, to offer what he had learned over the years. And now, seeing the way the market had transformed, he realized that sometimes the smallest actions could have the greatest impact. Temba had learned that the true measure of success wasn't in the products he sold or the profits he made, but in the connections he forged and the way he had contributed to the betterment of the village. As the sun set on the market, Temba looked around at the vendors who had once been rivals, but now stood together, united in their efforts. The flies were gone, and the market was no longer a place of frustration, but a place of harmony and collaboration. Temba knew that the village had learned something important, that success comes not from individual glory, but from working together. It wasn't about the flies or the meat, it was about the community, the relationships, and the shared wisdom that had brought them all together. The market was now thriving in a way it never had before, and Temba knew that this was only the beginning of what they could achieve together.